¿Qué tal? Soy Fiona Humbert Marshall y bienvenidos a Conversations in Between.
Hola, soy Domènec Romera. Bienvenidos a Conversations in Between.
Darko, according to your experience, when do clients start asking for help? And which would be their common signs for them before asking for your help?
I work mostly with organizations and leaders. They want to be successful, and also at the same time, they want to maintain the good image. So showing vulnerability is even more difficult. And I think on the contrary, I think organizations are actually quite vulnerable inside, but showing vulnerability is quite a step. And I think it's quite a courageous step and a step of awareness, usually of leaders who are ready to confront, let's say, with the real pains. So in my experience, it really rarely happens in a kind of proactive manner when things are going well, and then you try just to prevent that possibly things will go wrong. So most of the times it happens when what I call in the book the pressure of the problem. And for example, when the business results are suffering, when the market shares are falling or decreasing, where serious internal conflicts are coming in. So basically, when the pain is too big to ignore it, and then there is this moment, okay, maybe we cannot do this thing ourselves, or maybe we cannot do it in all these ways that we tried already. So I think that's this moment when the pressure of the problem is too big, so the business results are suffering. And that's usually the motivation. At the same time, it's very good motivation because it's also drive for change. So this pain is also something that is giving a fuel, in a way, to the process of systemic change that we are designing together.
Yeah, it seems, as you say, that it's this moment where there's almost no other option than seek for a deep for the transformation.
Yeah. I think there are different symptoms they see. Sometimes people, for example, people speak a lot. I think if you look in LinkedIn and public sphere, sometimes people speak a lot about toxic cultures. So, for example, and of course, not to generalize, because probably every case is different, because every history of the organization is different, and how you reach the point to toxic culture could be very, very different. And so, my point is that this toxicity is usually a sign of organizational trauma. So, I would prefer actually that we have a bit more empathy for organizations, and instead of labeling toxic, maybe we look beyond this toxicity and wondering, okay, how actually this toxicity came in the picture in the first place. And very often we speak about traumatized organizations, and this toxicity comes as a kind of a consequence of that. So basically, leaders see the symptoms, internal conflicts, sectors are not cooperating with each other, people are not being able to anticipate the needs of their customers anymore, looking more inwards than looking outside. So all sorts of different kind of symptoms that are in a way giving a message to the leaders. You need to look at what is happening in the system and underneath these things. So symptoms are just signs, but there's a moment when these symptoms, which are just expression of the patterns underneath, there's a moment when these symptoms are started to jeopardize their business results, and this is the moment when they ask for change.
They ask for help, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we understand it's difficult, and us with Dome also with the experience we have with the clients, it's difficult for them to come before, as you say, the pain shows, and in a way it's frustrating also to watch that, no?
In the book, I also speak about organizational health and organizational immunity from a systemic point of view. And I wish that would be kind of more like when we have a mental hygiene concept in psychology. It would be great to have some kind of systemic hygiene in organizations, that actually you look from time to time, you do kind of systemic check in a way how we are doing. So how is our systemic immunity? Instead of waiting,
yeah.
Consequences to become too big.
Super interesting. Systemic immunity. Yeah, sounds like would be a very powerful tool for the organizations, indeed. And I understand. So, like, before coming to the systemic immunity, you would obviously have to explain to the organization about systemic concepts and the work. No, so how is it your way of explaining that systemic approach to organizations?
Yesterday afternoon, I had a meeting with a new CEO, big company in Serbia. It is always for me this first encounter with somebody that I don't know, and somebody that I have no clue if he has any experience with anything systemic before. So I don't think I have a recipe on that, but I think for me, what is important before explaining, because it's not just about which words do you use, which graphics do you use, which concepts do you use, but for me, it is also about from where I'm speaking and can I really connect to that system and in a way, at least with one of my legs standing there and with another leg standing a little bit outside, like looking it from the outside. So in a way, the moment I'm explaining whatever, I think I need to be touched to the system that I'm talking about. So it cannot be just a theoretical frame that I'm just telling, okay, these are the systems and organizations are living systems. And this sounds like a lot of empty words sometimes. So it's I like how to use images sometimes. I think the images, and also in the book I tried to find good visualizations, and some of them work less, some of them work more with some people, and that really depends. I'm not really answering your question straightforward, but
in a way you're saying that rather than explaining so much the theory about the systemic intervention of work, you work on a connection first, obviously, with your client and its system, and from there you see, I imagine, what it is that what you need to show according to what the information they already have, or how deep you can go into the concept. I imagine the kind of an assessment, the first assessment, no?
Yes, and what I think what I do, probably not so intentionally, but now when I look back at the meeting from yesterday, what was important for me to kind of support the person to have more empathy for the system. So I think everybody knows nowadays in the leadership world and in corporate leadership too, that emotional intelligence is important and empathy as one of the leadership capabilities. But I try to just enlarge this a little bit. So I say, well, yes, and I have one picture which I would love to share with you also, is where I say the leader needs to show the empathy for individuals, but also empathy for the system as a whole. And that's something that resonates, for example, also resonated yesterday, because there's this moment you don't even need to say explicitly, in this approach, we see organizations as living and intelligent systems and so on and so on. I think it almost goes without saying that the empathy for the system is needed. And somehow, even without words or even talking about what the system is there. And then later a theory can follow. But I think this is like to see how we are on the same page and to what extent actually leaders can open their hearts, not just their minds, to what extent they can open their hearts to what's going on, which later in the process of systemic change will be essential.
That sounds beautiful to me. And I would say that part of the systemic change might come from these 2 points you have already said. No? People's leaders just opening their heart, and organizations being aware of, or leaders being aware of the empathy for the organization. Can you explain a little more about this systemic change I'm sure you're talking about in your book also?
Actually, in the process of writing, somewhere in the I have it actually here on my flip chart. There was one moment when there's one graphics that actually came together, and then the sentence that came to my mind is that as a leader, your task is to reconcile the past and the future of the organization in the present. I will tell you what it means now, so it looks maybe official, or maybe abstract. In a way, it's clear that due to organizational history, organizational experiences, including organizational trauma, that actually many organizations actually passed in their history, organizations develop certain patterns in their systems, and which is again then visible in behaviors and as what we call culture often. But this is the past thing. This is something when you look at backwards, looking in the past through history, through origin. So when we speak about systemic empathy, actually, it often means understanding the current patterns a little bit retrospectively in the sense of what was this solution for before, and what was the meaning of these patterns for the system before judging them, before disregarding them, before cutting them, and whatever you would like to do. So that's why I said it's the systemic empathy is needed. But systemic empathy kind of look a little bit backwards to the past and to the past pains that organization maybe had passed through. So actually it became what it is now. And then it became actually very clear to me that systemic change actually has another half. So this is just a part of the story. And maybe because of systemic constellation work, sometimes we have tendency to look a little bit more into the past. In transgenerational work, in family constellations in general, looking back a little bit more into the past, let's say to the source. At the same time, in the presence, what is happening on the other side is that the future is also coming in. So the future, and along with the potential of the organization. So basically this message, what could be the better version of the organization in the future? So what's the better version that organization can become? And this comes in different kinds of messages. So at the same time, in the system, you have interplay between the past and the future. You have a little bit also interplay, if you want to say, between trauma and potential to some extent. And then I was saying, okay, in these graphics that I made, I think you need systemic empathy to understand and to go beyond the obvious, to understand what are the root causes, the reasons why the system is like this. But at the same time, you need to have awareness and the connection to the potential of the organization. So in a way, you are reconciling the past and the future of the organization in the present. And I think that's probably the core of systemic change. Actually, so it's not only about dealing with the past, but it is dealing with the past with the awareness and a deep connection of what we could become as organization in the future.
It's so interesting. Those pains, that trauma connect to the potential of the upcoming future, no?
Yeah.
I see it very interesting. Talking about patterns, where do patterns in organizations come from?
And patterns is also coming back to your previous questions about introducing systemic approach. I think patterns is something that leaders can understand easier because they're kind of more tangible. Actually, in fact, in 2010, when I was still very much interested in emotional social intelligence and leadership, I was in US in a Case Western University meeting Richard Boyatzis, who was writing a lot about emotional and social intelligence together with Daniel Goleman. And they had this whole concept of emotional and social competencies for leaders that they explored in hundreds of the most successful companies in the world. And Richard was sharing this framework with us and saying, of course, in their approach, saying, well, how emotional intelligence is kind of what distinguishes outstanding leaders from, let's say, the average ones and so on. And these are the competencies. And there was a moment when he said, yes, but there are also two other competencies which we cannot put under the umbrella of emotional social competencies, which also distinguish outstanding leaders from the rest. And he said one is systems thinking, and second was pattern recognition. So back then, it meant something to me, but I can say today, this means a lot to me. And I see that. So intuitively, leaders understand patterns. Maybe they cannot name them in a systemic terms, but they understand something is happening that is beyond individuals. So it's not just a misperformance in certain individuals, lack of competencies and so on. So people say, okay, well, it seems the system itself has some habits and some ways of working, which has been almost forever there. But this forever is not true. And to come to your question, there are probably 7 sources of patterns there. And I think that's interesting because depending how long is organization history, also maybe how known is the organization history, maybe for some companies that actually lasted for 300 years, maybe that's more difficult to trace. But I think there are 7 sources. So one source is for sure the patterns of the founders. So which you can see easily in family businesses, how family businesses are just often just a replication of the founder itself or himself or herself. So patterns of the founders is one. Second is this moment or societal moment when the organization is founded. So for example, organizations that are founded in the middle of wars or in the middle of economical crisis or in the middle of earthquake, they might develop different kinds of patterns and ways of surviving than organizations that maybe are just founded in the middle of a peaceful period of prosperity. So the societal context is also very important. The third one is when organization is part of the larger organizational system, and it happens a lot with, for example, in acquisitions. and also mergers. So actually, this is moments when patterns from a larger system are coming to the smaller system. It could be in teams or departments or parts. So basically, direction is from the larger to the smaller. That's a kind of typical. So of course, the fourth one is a survival response to organizational trauma to some events or long-lasting periods of exhaustion. So trauma doesn't have to be one huge event. It could be also a long-lasting period of exhausting. So to survive, organizational system develops certain patterns. The fifth one would be what we know from systemic work when the principles of healthy systems, of completeness, of order and balance are disturbed. Patterns are some kind of self-regulating mechanisms to that. Sixth is also the moments of joint learning. So there are moments when organizations in their past had moment of joint common learning how to solve certain problems, and this becomes a pattern. So basically this becomes like, this is the way we solve problems here. Because it was so successful before, we think the same way we can apply it to anything in the future. And then you're facing some challenges. And the seventh, which I think is important one, there are also patterns which are not only related to the past, but also patterns related to the potential. And I think they are parts of the system which always resonate with the potential. And you can see that in the bigger complex systems, so in the bigger organizations, that some parts of the organizations, like little teams here and there, they are doing something different. They are developing patterns which are different than the rest. And very often these teams are kind of working in the service of the organizational potential in a kind of showcasing or almost prototyping how this whole organization can be potentially in the future. So I think that's also an important piece. So when we look at the patterns, we just should not forget that also in the same time in the system, you might have the blocking patterns and you might have the thriving patterns. So you might have ones which are kind of more something that is related to the past and something that is more related to the future.
Yeah, super interesting to
Super.
integrate the past, the present, and the future all together and within the patterns. Yeah, that's great insight. Thank you for sharing that insight, Darko. So now that you gave us a little bit of an overview on how you work with the patterns, so let's say, how is it for you, the systemic intervention? No? So can you tell us a little bit more on how do you work with the actual constellation in the organization? What other method or intervention do you use in order to show those patterns and start with this process of transformation for the organization?
I think that's a bit more complex. And I think in the book I was trying to avoid the recipe since it's not you have 7 steps that you need to pass, but it's actually the process itself. It's designed on the way. What is important is to be co-designed. So first of all, it's not that the consultant comes in and then designs the process for the organization. It's the process you need to pass through to be healed, but it is because it's a little bit like doing the twofold thing at the same time. So at the same time, the systemic change is essentially the change that works with organizational patterns. So I would say if there's no change in patterns, you cannot say that systemic change happened. But in order for that to happen, I think there's a parallel process which we can call leadership transformation. So it's not only, okay, here we are as leaders, we look at our system, we look at our patterns as problems to solve, and we find a way to solve it. It doesn't work that way because it also requires leaders to be ready to engage in certain leadership or leaders transformation process at the same time. Because to create conditions for systemic change, very often it means to change something essentially in leadership as well. And process is literally like a twofold. One, you could call it like diagnostics or understanding, pinpoint, okay, these are the patterns, and maybe with some systemic framework, we understand why it is like that. But at the same time, we as leaders, we need to create conditions for this change to be possible. And when I say create conditions, this means also, for example, building more self of interconnectedness amongst them, because they're not excused from the patterns. For example, if you have a pattern of fragmentation in the organization, when sectors are not cooperating with each other, it is natural that the same patterns the leadership team shows as well. So they're also not cooperating with each other. They also don't feel we are on the same boat. So rather looking at themselves separately. So, which is already change in the leadership team level, but I think they also need to create similar kind of change in the whole organization. So to say creating conditions is meaning not just understanding, even systemic understanding of system dynamics and the reasons why patterns are there without judgment, just noticing and so on. I come back to that more practically, but it is also about creating conditions of interconnectedness. So interconnectedness is kind of one of the prerequisites. Also, enough psychological safety so that people actually can talk about these things. So very often we address things which are kind of, as I said in the beginning, also there's a lot of vulnerability in there, and also maybe even shame, maybe something that we would like don't talk about openly, or we don't want to. We would rather make these things disappear. Yeah. That's, for example, one of the wishful thinking of lots of leaders is that they can simply jump into the future. Yeah. But then the patterns in the past is pulling them back. So that's in the graphic I was referring, and I share with you, the process of systemic change. Somehow, to reach the future, you need to go a little bit through the past and then to the future. So almost like a Back to the Future somehow in the movie. So maybe to come back to you in this diagnostics phase, it really depends. But I like to do a lot of interviews first, especially with leadership teams. And in these interviews, I think I listen with all of my systemic ears and heart, and trying to listen through their stories in a way, not just what they're saying, but also what the system is telling me through them. So not only what their needs are as individual members of leadership teams, but also what's there in the system that wants to be shown here, that wants to be told.
The voice of the system.
Be resolved. Yeah, I think that's my curiosity there. At the same time, I'm assessing what is the capacity for change in this particular leadership team. So it's not just, okay, we have really like how ready they are. So how safe is there? Yeah, and how they create safety. What's the level of interconnectedness there? Or we really need to work on that amongst the team first. So parallelly, I'm listening to these two things. And there are moments when I can also use constellations in a way to understand what's, maybe to get another layer of understanding, maybe of some reasons, what is this solution is, what are these patterns a solution for, where exactly they're coming from. And constellations there could be very useful because in organizations, there are a lot of stories, like a mythology. And often these stories are not true. You know, so develop their own explanations why things are the way they are. And for example, especially for certain patterns that are bothering them at the moment, they have theories about how it came, maybe, and they even blame some people who left and blame the previous owner. And then sometimes in constellations, you realize, well, that actually it's not exactly the source of the patterns that you think, or maybe they make the story. The story was just a little kind of cover up. And that can give an additional insight about what these patterns were original solution for or reaction to, and therefore also provide inspiration and the pathway towards intervention, basically. So diagnostic is a big thing in a way. Diagnostic is a big thing, and then there is a critical moment when sometimes leaders are confronted with this truth. You know, we have this in the systemic work, we have this moment of standing in truth. You know, when something is spoken and you know it's true, you cannot, kind of
Not ignore it, and you cannot avoid it. It's just
ignoring is not an option in a way.
like not anymore.
But then there is a moment when we need to go into the intervention phase. And then there is sometimes this critical moment. Should we go there or should we not? Do we have courage? Do we or not enough? Or is it painful enough or not painful enough? So if we step there, there's a kind of point of no return. So we won't be the same anymore if we continue this way. And there's this moment when they really need to give permission. So that the permission maybe you get in the beginning formally, and maybe even without full awareness. But this is the moment when the leadership team has to, or leader, or whoever is in the kind of full official charge, in charge, they need to give permission to change. And then we can start doing interventions.
Interesting. Yeah. Once it's been seen and they've realized it, it's when it really matters, no? That they actually give you their permission. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And they know what the game is actually about.
Mhm.
I would like to ask you something, because you were talking about psychological safety. It is important for you to do a previous work with leaders in order to achieve that psychological safety state?
Yeah. I don't. You don't get psychological safety on a
I
button.
know, I know. I know. But I mean, before going into an intervention, for you, it's important that they are in that mood that they can just, be themselves with the right to stand up and say, "Hey, go, guys, I need this, I need that. I want your permission. I need permission. I want to give you permission, whatever."
Maybe one thing that I do more intuitively, I think now it comes to my mind. I think I also use myself as an instrument and wondering how safe do I feel here while talking to these people.
Okay.
Okay. And of course, that's just one piece of information. Do I feel safe here? Or I don't try to, I mean, I do it more intuitively in a way. And also wonder if I feel, for example, some particular fear, because then, let's say realistically, I have no reason to be afraid. But then there's a moment when maybe I fear a bit of, and I'm wondering, maybe this fear, maybe what I'm picking up, maybe I'm in kind of representation of something from their system. And then I'm wondering whose fear this might be.
Mm.
Okay, I just take it as information. I don't know, of course. There's a moment, I remember I was meeting one leader here before coaching. It was kind of coaching conversation. And I looked at their website before. And then, organizations, they have organizational values often explained. And they also had something like, and they had, I think, 5 or 6. But amongst these 5 or 6, there was a value of trust. And it was interesting that the first 5, they had like kind of 2-3 sentences explaining. I think it was something like probably commitment. I cannot recall now. So it was just a few lines, but the trust was a whole paragraph, like an essay about trust. And I was talking to her, I felt really strange. I felt really somehow at the same time mistrusted, at the same time afraid. And I was wondering, wow, there must be something interesting there. So these kind of things, I think I take it as a kind of signal. And yes, by getting to know the system a little bit, also not just the leadership team, but also people from lower in hierarchy. That's why I like to do these interviews, because when I do interviews, I connect to more people, to more voices. So something that you cannot get in questionnaires, in assessment tools. You get some insights there, but in this kind of how it feels to be there and how really safe is, I think that's important piece of assessment there. And yes, and as a part of the process, I think I tend to address that explicitly, that in order for the change to happen, I think, and it's usually part of leadership transformation piece that I was talking about before. So that the creating psychological safety is part of the leadership role, and from sometimes that's completely new, especially in the systems which has completely different patterns and maybe are just completely driven by results at the expense of anything, including people, where people actually, especially, for example, after acquisitions or some mergers, when a lot of people were made redundant, then the sense of safety, especially if this process was dealt in a disrespectful way, in a sometimes brutal way, of course, then the sense of psychological safety is lost, and then to restore it, I think it's already a systemic change, so to say, itself. So basically, it's a psychological safety. You can say it's a condition, precondition, but at the same time, it's also indicator. It can also be indicator that something positively actually happened there.
And thank you, Darko. So we have this notion of time, no, as systemic facilitator, which is so important. No, we know that somehow we like the idea of thinking that we're like freezing a little bit the time, no? It's difficult. This is a very practical question, but since we also have hopefully an audience of other colleagues listening to us, and some of them starting as facilitators, how do you deal with the intervention and the time in order to transmit that importance to your clients? How do you make them make the time for our interventions, and how do you work with it?
Well, that's partially related to the very first question in this interview about how big is the pressure of pain, and how big is the sense of urgency that you need to do something. When the sense of urgency is there and the pressure of pain is there, then they make this priority. Of course, from my pattern that you asked me before about, overgiving, sometimes I wish to make, I wish these processes are given a higher priority in a way. But at the same time, I also tend to respect, and I also learn to respect their capacity and their speed. So maybe I have insight about what would be useful for them to do and how they can be so much better if they would overcome these patterns that they have, and maybe nurture some others that they can see there. But the change in the system sometimes takes its own pace and its own rhythm. So I'm also wondering, and I think that's also has been a big learning for me, to meet them where they are. And that's why this assessing of capacity for change is important. So if their capacity for change is not huge, especially in a highly traumatized organizations, this capacity for change is normally not so big. You need to go slowly, and maybe it's too slow for me. Maybe sometimes because of my, purpose and I don't know, wish to bring the change somehow. But this is something I also need to unlearn a lot, and I think that systemic work actually helped me a lot to unlearn that in a way, to have this ambition to change, but rather to agree to the things as they are. And also, which also means to agree to their capacity and to agree to their rhythm, how much change that they can absorb. So, which also made me less angry, so to say. I'm not angry at them if they don't take this process seriously. I think it's their process, not mine.
But
And
as you say, like it resonates all you're saying with one of my first intervention, this little frustration that you just want more and you see, you observe and you want, but it's difficult to
yes,
adjust to that.
at the same time, it might be too soon and too fast for them. Yeah. I think the same thing happens in a family constellation. Sometimes you have insight for the client what would be good, and even what the field is showing somehow, but the client might be not be ready yet to face that. Might be too soon. You know, when you have situations of family deaths, when your I don't know, your brother died or mother died, I think, and you have a sense in the field that, or you see in the field that actually might be useful that the client says things like, I respect your death. But the client is in the mourning stage. I think it's too soon. So in a way, in organization is not different. In a way, it's really sometimes the small steps, what they look to me, the small steps are big for them. And one thing I'm also learning, especially in the very complex systems, that it's not about revolution. It's not really not about some kind of huge change imposed on the system, but actually the system needs to digest change. So that's why actually, in a way, it's almost like creating new learnings in the system. So basically the system needs to learn to do things in a different way. So it's not just instead of this pattern. So for example, instead of mistrusting your colleagues and relying on bureaucratic measures, from tomorrow on, you need to trust because it's good. No, it doesn't go that way. I think you need to create conditions and smaller pieces of experience when people try to learn or relearn how to trust each other. And when they see the positive consequences of that, these can settle in. And then you can start with something else. So in a way, you break down the change into something, I think, very experienced colleague of mine from Australia, Sarah, she calls it micro learnings. So creating these kind of micro learnings inside of the system, allowing system to change, and you follow the effect of every single bit. And only when the previous bit created some impact and created some change, you introduce the new piece. So it's not just all of a sudden, boof, everything will be different from tomorrow on.
The metaphor, no, we used a lot of the seed and letting, no, you plant the seed and then it just starts growing and then you have to wait and see how it evolves.
Before you plant next seeds.
Exactly, exactly.
I was trying to figure out how it would be an intervention when you just are trying to calibrate, whether you are too fast or whether that thing is too soon. How would it be? I mean, it's just asking them, it's enough for you. I mean, you feel fine with this now? Do you want to go ahead? That would be the formula or kind of.
Well, I tend to see these processes as a longer term processes. So nothing happens
Okay.
in a session. So it's not, maybe I missed to say that. So for me, using constellations in this kind of work is just a part of the process.
Yeah, okay.
So, and it can be part in the diagnostics phase. It could also be part when you're exploring different ways of intervening. It could be in different parts of the process. But it's usually we speak about processes which are, I don't know, a year long or several years long. Nothing that happens in 1, 2 months, or especially in complex systems. And then following the dynamics and following are the steps made in reality is also giving me feedback a little bit. Um, it's also like peeling layer to layer. So maybe we peeled one layer, maybe we created certain level of psychological safety, maybe there's a certain awareness, what do we need to do? But then you face another layer of maybe something old or obstacle or fear or concern. So, and I think another layer of empathy. So it goes a little bit in layers. So I think I follow that a lot. Whether, for example, what has been agreed or what has been co-created, agreed, whether this is being actually implemented in reality or not, or something is still, kind of preventing us from moving. And then it's not necessarily a question of time, it's also a question of this permission that I was talking about before. So sometimes they say, yes, we would like to do it, we'd like to do it, but as sometimes the permission is still not there.
Yeah.
Is missing. And the permission to change has to be super clear, I would say, and indisputable in a way. But it's true that it is, I think, inner learning for a consultant to know when it's too much and when I'm overcooking the shrimp, which I was so I think I'm still, I don't have a full recipe, but I know the moment when I stepped a step too much. And I think when it's too much, it loses its effectiveness.
Has to do, yeah, regarding this Fiona first asked you about interventions and the constellations, and I was wondering how you managed to create that content, how you managed to create that container, I think they call it, some of them call it, or the holding space or the membrane, no? It depends on who says that, no? Or Juan Londoño or
Yeah.
it depends on these, or how do you create that atmosphere to work with them?
I understand what you're asking, and I think I've been wondering, and so for me, the question is rather who creates the container? And
Okay.
yeah, because in organizational context change, maybe my perspective is a little bit different. Because, for example, if you compare it to family constellation workshops, which are kind of typical setting for people who know not anything about systemic constellations, normally you have one person from a family system that is there, that is bringing the topic on behalf of the system and on behalf of him or herself, but the family is not there physically. Yeah. So when I work with organizations, the organization is there. They're not, it's not just a one person. I mean, it's a little bit different situation when you have somebody bringing what we call sometimes the business topic instead of family topic in a constellation setting, and then you constellate something without organization being present. But my work is inside of the organization means that the organization is there and the leadership team is there. So somehow it is not my task. I mean, actually it is to some extent, but creating container and building the container, I think it's part of the leadership team itself. And I think my task, and I understand that sometimes for the good reasons, they're not able to do that, maybe in the beginning. Trauma, mistrust, whatever experiences they had. And that's part of the leadership transformation piece. But in order to create systemic change in the organization, they need to hold the container. So it's not the external consultant coming in, holding container and then leaving. I think in that case, I would step into their role. So I think I'm trying to be very, very careful. And I think it's very tempting. And I think I learned a lot that from John Whittington. I think he speaks a lot about these traps and invitations under quotation marks for consultants. And one of them is when certain leadership capacities are not there, or when leaders are not taking fully their place, one of the trap for the consultant is to become leader of the team or leader of the organization, and it's so tempting. Your ego is probably very happy, but if you want to be useful for them, you have to reject that temptation. Yeah? So that's part of my work is also this kind of inner work with myself. So knowing from where I'm working. So my role is rather to supporting them in building this ability to keep the container or to create the container, which in the end of the day is in practice is a very similar thing like creating psychological safety in their teams and in their organizations. So being able to hold space for the change to happen, and for the change to happen, people need to talk about difficult things. So in a way, inner organizational work maybe is a little bit different than just when I'm running my own workshop. Yeah, that's I think maybe considering what exactly your role is. I think it's part of and having clarity from where do you work as an external consultant, what's exactly your place is essential. And for me, the place I'm the systemically speaking, I'm the last one there. Yeah, maybe I'm the first in a sense of, and I think I have to be careful to say it here first, when it comes maybe to bringing in the systemic framework as such, but I'm definitely the last one because I'm the last one in the system. So I'm coming as the last one after all of them there. And I'm just temporary belonging there. But I need to remember that I'm the last one there, and it's their role to be in charge, to be in lead.
Yeah, so interesting. Fiona, would you like to do any other question before we start with the trauma? Now that he was talking about.
I think you covered really well all the points that we wanted to mention. I mean, we could talk so much and
Of course, of course.
I'm tempted, but let's not be greedy. Just like systemic work. Let's just read the room and let's keep on going a little bit.
Okay, great then. You've been talking about trauma many times since we started the interview, this conversation, and you've lived in a civil war. You are a child of a divided war-torn nation. What remains in the culture of a country that has experienced such history, not only in Serbia but also in Spain with our civil war, or in the whole Europe during the World War. What remains in the culture of organizations?
It's a big question. I think what it was. One thing is actually, I think it's interesting. At least lately, I think in the world, I think it seems that kind of trauma awareness is growing, globally speaking. I think if you compare maybe I don't know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I think trauma was something that was mentioned probably in the smaller circles of psychotherapists and maybe psychologists, or maybe some peace building workers, people in the front line or after the wars, trying to rebuild society. But nowadays, as you can see, we have really a huge production of books and knowledge. So, and there's a big awareness about how we need to be trauma informed. And I think that's the word I think used lately. And we also speak about trauma informed leadership nowadays also. that leaders also need to understand the dynamics and mechanisms of trauma, not only psychologists or therapists or constellators. And a huge piece is around individual trauma. So we have beautiful work of Peter Levine and many of others, Gabor Mate, and many others who speak about how trauma is stored in the body, how our nervous system responds to that. And that's on a very individual level. Collectively, there's also growing interest, I think, and Thomas Hubel speaks a lot about collective trauma. And I was following some of his courses and even some Balkan study group that was under Thomas' framework that we actually met. I think 3-4 years ago, we had a whole year process of reflecting, sharing about trauma in collective trauma or traumas in the Balkans, because we don't speak only about the war in the 90s or wars in the 90s. I think the Balkan is where I come from it has a long history of collective trauma, and many of them completely buried and undealt with. And of course, we suffer from that. If we have trauma-informed leadership in these countries, I don't think so. So that's one thing. Second thing, what I've learned also, even with my good intentions and my good heart and my family loyalty to multi-ethnic family that remain together in times of war, which I think is probably one biggest achievement of our smaller and wider family. Instead of being on different sides, I think my parents really managed to keep the family together. I think that was big, and I think, as I said in the beginning, in your quiz, one of my patterns is really to connect the divided, or to bridge the divided. And I think I can clearly, having my parents behind me and bringing two religions, two ethnicities together, celebrating two Easters, two Christmases, having two citizenships. That's for me personally, source. And yet, I think when you speak about organizational trauma, we rarely speak about that. I think there's a little bit bits and pieces coming in here now. For example, in UK, there's a wonderful consultant and coach, Ty Francis. I think he lately published a white paper on dealing with organizational trauma, which I think is a wonderful tool. Also was a big inspiration also for me. But organizations are not islands, so they don't live in vacuum. Although sometimes they believe, everything happens under, behind their walls and logos and policies and flags and the gates. But they are under influence of the bigger society too. I said already that some of the organizational patterns originate from the moments when organization was founded, and that could be very much linked to the societal situation there. So organizations founded in the 90s, in the middle of hyperinflation, huge crises, wars, probably they develop certain kind of resilience and certain kind of capacity to survive, even in a difficult moments later. But what I see here as a consequence of trauma, because we know that in trauma, there is usually one part of the whole. So whatever the whole is, whole could be society, whole could be the organization. And Franz Rupert says that actually, as a response to trauma, the system splits into parts. So one part is still, this healthy part that is still doing the work, maybe working, producing, in private life, maybe paying the bills, going to work, going to school. Then there is one which is kind of survival mechanism. And this survival mechanism is often a pattern that actually the organizations developed or systems developed in order to survive. So, for example, in order to survive, we need to shift to our corners so we are not so much exposed. So in order to survive, we have more chances to survive if we are split into the corners in our little sectors than if we stay together. Paradoxically, sometimes staying together is you are more exposed, like. And then there's a third part, that's something that becomes kind of split off or sacrificed or temporarily lost. And I say temporary because I don't think it's lost forever, but it feels like it's frozen, is out of reach. And what I see in traumatized societies, I'm often wondering, what is the quality that we as society lost in these situations, especially without wanting to deal with that? So what qualities did we lose that we would actually desperately need nowadays? And one of the things, for example, if you come to Serbia, you have always this sense of, I think Jan Jakov was also, while traveling to the Balkans, also sensing that really well, that it feels like the potential of this country is some kind of trapped, like almost like locked, like there's a kind of, almost there's like a metal lid on it, and then somebody locked it. And this potential is kicking this lid, but this lid is too strong still. And it's related to trauma work, I think, still. And so, for example, I think what we lost here is, or temporarily lost, is this ability to vision long term, to have this kind of longer term society vision, which could be easily a consequence. My theory is that one of the consequences of traumatized society is losing its capacity to vision, which then reflects back into the organizations. And you see that difficulties in a long-term strategic thinking, in the long-term visioning, in long-term planning. So I think it's an example how things can really spill off from a wider system to the smaller system too.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting what you're saying about the vision. And I understand, most of organizations that have this behavior, they're only looking for short-term results. And so if there's a problem, they're going to look for short-term solutions for their short-term problems, basically, And so you spoke about also at the beginning of our conversation about toxicity in organizations, and this is a symptom of a trauma, of the organizational trauma, right? I mean, I myself personally have worked in different organizations in Spain and France, and I've went through those feelings, toxicity, of those big companies without a vision, missing this connection between the employees and their leaders, and only looking for this kind of how can we make money, and how, like, on a short-term way, and lacking this deep connection. I found it very interesting what you're talking about, organizational traumas, and as you say, it's something that's not being mentioned so much. Obviously, because of this whole lack of showing weakness and being vulnerable. I mean, we're seeing it with most of human beings. So of course, imagine as a whole system and organization showing weakness is even more complicated, right? And even more difficult to achieve. And I mean, I found it so frustrating as observing that we can learn so much from sharing those weaknesses and entering that new path of being vulnerable, that we're missing out so much information there, Like, one thing is to recognize it, and imagine being able to share those experiences. It's almost so far away as a possibility, I don't know if it's something that we can wish for, or how we can slowly, how can we help leaders to kind of be okay, or how can we help talking about it how can we kind of, start putting this little seed on it's okay to recognize and to accept that there's a trauma in the organization, and that, we have something to learn, and how can we share it also with the rest of the world in a way.
Yeah. Well, there are several things there. I think one is calling cultures and companies, especially cultures. I think that's usually a term. I think toxicity or is a symptom. I think and it's usually not just one. It's usually the complex a number of symptoms together. And I understand from a personal point of view, especially if you're suffering individually in a system like that, I think the normal need, the kind of the survival strategy would to make kind of distance. It's simply to survive in a way to make a distance from what you see as
Avoid the pain, not to be hurt. Yeah.
it's a survival strategy. Understand from a personal point of view of somebody in a system like that, that calling it toxic, that using the word toxicity as a label is a way of distancing. Okay, so this is toxic and I'm not. Okay, so I understand that from this point. At the same time, calling if you open your heart more, and I think not as an employee, but really as a leader, as somebody who has good intention with this system. I think in order to especially, for example, if you came to a company that is already like that and you are, with good intentions, I think using label toxicity or using label like toxic cultures, I think it also closes your heart in a way. Yeah. So in a way, that's why I said it's maybe better to use traumatized cultures than toxic cultures. It opens your heart, it's open your life. No matter how crazy or irrational this might sound on the surface, but this has been a road that has been a long road actually coming to that point. And so that's one thing. The second thing is organizations are also very much exposed, so they need to keep the facade of being well and fine. I was speaking about and in that sense that organization might be even more vulnerable than families because they are so exposed. Family, they're still in your private sphere, but this you're observed all the time, by your customers, by competitors, and you need to create this image of that doing good, that actually that you are attractive, that you're performing, that you are attractive employer, that you are, the image is important. But sometimes image breaks because of of what we call toxicity here. Maybe it pressures and also then creates hurts the image, and it's part of those things that you asked me in the beginning. What could be the reasons for invitation to start systemic change? And one of them could be also that image is hurt outside due to this kind of things. But looking inside, I think that's that first of all, leaders need to understand a little bit that organizations actually can be traumatized. So many leaders don't know this. It's a simple fact, but people believe maybe that organizations are still machines. If organizations are like machines, you change one part, you change another part, and or you change the oil, but organizations are living systems, and living systems can be traumatized, as we can be, as families can be, as societies can be. So I think that's already a paradigm shift. If you see organization as a living system and understand that organizations are not trauma-free, so they can be traumatized too. At the same time, I don't think necessarily it's a bad thing. And what I mean by that is it might have lots of so-called negative consequences, but at the same time, I think it's very paradox trauma that surviving trauma as organization, you also, at the same time, you limit some things, and maybe some things get temporarily lost, as I said. But at the same time, you as organization, you develop a lot of capabilities, a lot of capacities, a lot of strength, a lot of resilience. So there might be some things that in the current state you don't like, or they might maybe blocking you, they might be hurting your image, they might be things to change. But at the same time, while working with trauma, you need also to acknowledge all the benefits and all the systems learning that actually systems actually benefited from that situation. So trauma work is not just deleting systems and forgetting the trauma, but I think it's really about acknowledgement of all the learning, and at the same time choosing another way where the potential is pulling you.
Yeah.
So acknowledgement
Yeah.
and
Acknowledgement and the learning and the strength. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and therefore, I think if you call culture organization toxic, I think there are two consequences. First of all, you are too judgmental,
Mm-hmm.
and which immediately means that your heart is not open and you cannot see beyond the judgment, beyond the criticism, which, as I said already, for individual employees who are suffering, I understand as a self-care mechanism. But as a leader who wants to change, I think you need to see beyond. And an acknowledgement, what was good actually in that situation that actually brought to the system to be as it is and where it is at the moment.
When I asked you my question, I was connecting with my past as a young person moving to Spain, and my first professional experiences in those big corporate companies, and I was connecting with this kind of victim perpetrator relation. I have this memory, of like I was the victim and the bosses were the perpetrator, connecting and kind of ignoring us, and I think I still have that. And for me, it's also good insight on how to deal, nowadays with the organization as a whole. But I still have this little thing in me, that's like, okay, I'm the victim, and I see it as toxicity. And as you said, I have when I connect with that, I can't open my heart still, but I
Yeah,
will work on that.
that's interesting what you're saying, because terminology, I think the words matter a lot. And that's, for example, the word system is a not neutral word. It's especially in different contexts. But I think in this particular context, if you speak from the point of Balkans, the term system rather has a negative meaning. So either or it's very technical in a way, like you create a system, how you learn, how you do things, or how you organize your cupboard in your kitchen. That could be nice, but it's very technical, kind of creating order. But in societal terms, I think we see system as something distant, as something that we don't belong to, and something that works against us. And I think that's very collective here. So part of my role here is also to introduce the different meaning of the word system, which is not easy because it's coming back to your victim perpetrator dynamics. I think there's a tendency collectively here that we see ourselves as victims of the system, very invisible system that actually works against you, like a little bit like a 1984 George Orwell. But the way we use the word system is, and I think that's part of also, we talk about toxicity, that the moment you step into the system, organizational system, you belong and you are part. Yeah. So your task as a leader is, yes, you can work for the betterment of your system, but at the same time knowing that you are also part there. So you also have a role to play. And you cannot just separate yourself and work on the system. So you basically you work with that's why for me these two things, well, system change and leadership transformation are two things in one, because you do it while you are in the system and leading the change. If I'm getting here.
It
And
happens. Sorry, Fiona, first.
no, just to finish of my thought process and about what you're saying. Of course, I mean, it's like this kind of employee, this whole trauma is also the lack of responsibility in the organization, of course, and that's why it's, as you say, the important work is with the leaders, and from there, from that responsibility and that capacity and possibility of change, to start working, of course, with them. Anyways, thank you. That's it.
For me, it happens quite often that when we work with the team. Sometimes the first point is that you're gonna work with the team, but without the leader, and then we go, whoa, 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 wait a minute. How do we do that? I mean, that's not possible. I mean, the leader is part of that system. So, and it happened to me just last week. And where's the leader? Well, hasn't got time. But you work with the team. Yeah, but the team is not team at full without him or her, no? And it's quite it creates a trauma also, right? Because you're not doing your job as you would like to.
Yeah. Probably, I don't know this particular case, but it's I mean, I think it's important to work with leaders also one-to-one, in a way, just to check these kind of things. How much actually they see themselves as a part, or how much they see themselves as a part.
Part.
I think it's super important piece, and probably there are good reasons. It could also be indicator that they feel more safe to speak openly when the person is not there.
Yeah.
Coming back to psychological safety.
Coming back to what you said before, for me, it's also very important. For us, it's very important to have those interviews, because then those things show up, and you say, okay, I know what it happens. Then I have to have a talk to someone else. No. Is there anything that you would like to share with us, Darko, regarding your new book? Something that you wanted to share before we shift into another kind of questions?
Yeah, so we're just talking about you as a facilitator, while you're working with the leaders and the organizations. What patterns do you observe of yours that come out the most, and what do you want to share about that, if you feel like it?
Yeah. So I think probably the two I mentioned already. One is this thing that actually to connect the divided, and
Which
maybe not to jump to that too fast, because also I think systemic work actually helped me a lot with that, in a way that there are good reasons why things are the way they are. So in a way, I'm also trying to, so to say, love the separation in a way, and also to acknowledge the separation, because sometimes, as we know, separation could be a survival mechanism, but could also serve the system in different ways. So separation is not necessarily bad in a way. And nevertheless, as we know, also sometimes in the system dynamics, some things are separated in a way that after a while, this separation starts to block the system to move forward, which is something else. But I think for me, it's also to acknowledge that, and also not being too helpful. I think that's it's a lifetime learning exercise. I think
Not being too helpful is maybe like the sentence, no, that's like resonates the most also with me. Not go over, not go beyond.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why we are doing this work. But it's but for me, the question is always to wonder, okay, fine, maybe this is helpful, or this is my understanding or mind or wish. But I try to distance myself in a way of what Bert Hellinger was calling empathy center. So in a way, a little bit like just accepting the things as they are and the good reasons for why they are like that. And also wondering not what might be helpful, but what might be useful here. And sometimes even saying that you're not able to do anything here could be very useful intervention, which somebody who is prone to help might be very difficult to say. But paradoxically, I think it brings strength to them. It brings back responsibility where it belongs. So I'm learning still to find my way there, but also learning to each and every time to accept things as they are. Because as we know from systemic world, acknowledgement is the first step of change. So not the change itself, but acknowledgement what is the first step in change. Basically, not wanting to change it is first step in change.
I agree. So something kind of superficial question that I have, which is, so you get nervous, impatient, sorry, bored when...
Maybe it's different. I don't know if it's impatient, but it's a little bit like in anticipation, let's say, to meet the team, or especially in a longer process when some things, steps are made. Sometimes I have this excitement, and I think maybe I'm just now checking in myself, is it belonging to this being too helpful? But I think it's also, there's another source of excitement of being in this kind of doing mode somehow. I don't know how to explain that. I think there's something that comes, I have this insight or insights and moments when things come together, and I think methodologically, for example, and I'm looking forward to see how this might work. So then I get impatient, like, let's try. But
Okay.
yeah, and bored. I get bored. I think I get bored when there's a double message. When there's which actually means that there is no permission to change. So when there's double message, like, yes, we would like to do that, we would like to do that, we would like to do that, but at the same time, they're not doing it.
Yeah.
And then I get feeling like, yeah, and as I say, it's also accepting their pace, accepting
Yeah. Yeah.
pace. I also kind of, and it's probably one pattern of mine which I hate the most, is this double bind. You know, when you're kind of stuck in, in whatever you do doesn't work, or yeah, simply there is no. Which is interesting for me. Then wondering, okay, so what's the source of this boredom? Maybe it's more than boredom. Maybe it's more stuckness then. Yeah.
Sounds to me something like, for me, it would be some kind of frustration for me. For me, yeah. Let's say papers on the floor or representatives. what do you prefer if possible?
That really depends on ways of working. I think here when I do individual coaching, I work a lot with well, sometimes paper, sometimes I have my cut out things from fields. It's kind of more fabric thing, which can be used. I think in the individual setting, these floor markers, papers, I think that's super useful. At the same time, when I work individually, I also tend to step into representation of different parts. So you can say maybe it's kind of combination of these two. I think, of course, the personal representation is, I think it's embodiment. I think embodiment is and I think in the representation itself. That's why I think even if I use papers or floor markers, I ask the client to step into the certain positions or myself stepping into some positions in a way that through the body you get even more information. But I see the benefit of all and combining. So it's not necessarily either or. For example, in the workshop in Slovenia, I did exercise where in a small constellation when people were doing something in couples. But there was a moment when I added an element which was from this fabric for cut out floor markers, which could be additional element, not the person, but the floor marker. So I would say combination it could also be useful. Of course, I think embodiment gives a deeper insight, but I will not be so dogmatic in the sense like you have to sense also what's best for this particular group or the person, and yeah, I think as long as there is a connection to the field and connection to the parts and some kind of representative perception, you don't have to have 15 people
Not always.
There's actually a question somehow I feel like we skipped, which was the working with the body.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not, I don't know.
We skip it.
Skipped it, no?
Yeah.
It's always like for me, I mean, for us, it's always a big question, no? Like with our clients, okay, how much do we, like, of course, when there's the field, and as you said, the embodiment and the representation, and most or many clients, in our experience, lack this
connection,
awareness, no? Consciousness of how the body is important canal, how do you say?
Yeah.
Receptor, no? And has so much information, the body has so much information. So without scaring them, we always try to kind of, induce and share information about that. It's for us, it's a struggle. How important is it for you to bring awareness to that? And how do you make them connect? What's your recipe once again with that?
I come back to the constellation work itself. I remember I was working with one big company here on their culture change program. I mean, they call it culture change. I told them you cannot change culture directly. You change the system first, and then the culture is following. Because in my understanding, culture is just a mirror of what's happening inside of the system dynamics. So when they say we want to change the culture, I said, well, it's not just let's talk about values, but it's actually looking underneath. And I told them one thing. We had an offsite with their senior leadership team and wider team, and I asked them, "Do you know what is the best instrument to assess your company culture?" And then they probably would think, "Wow, we have this, the Denison model. We have a McKinsey or whatever." And I said, "No, it's your body, because the way you feel when you enter the company." It's telling you everything about how is the culture there. So use your body as instrument to feel how is it for you, but also how is it for other people who work there. Because these feelings in your body that you bring home is the first thing when somebody asks you, how is it to work there? These are the first thing that you will say. Everything that actually happens in your body. And I think that was something that I could understand in a way. It doesn't solve the issue that you're saying if people are disconnected or not. If this connection is there, well, you can always try to assess is this is something completely personal due to some personal history, family, trauma, whatever, or it's also a systemic symptom that the body is somehow sacrificed. So people are just walk with their heads there, which could be also interesting. Maybe it's a moment, So were there any time in the history of organization where people were allowed to be here with a full body? Or maybe something happened, which could be an interesting point of exploration if when it started like that actually people just think, they don't feel. And so I think bringing body is important piece. I think it's a way of including and making the thing complete. So I think it goes beyond the question of purely technical, how we use body in constellations if people are able to feel, which is important. But I think I think I would see it rather as if this is the situation, maybe it's a symptom. What has been lost and why?
Well, thank you for sharing, and I like the approach you gave that you shared. Thank you for sharing that too. I think it's simple and somehow tangible for them because they can project themselves and they can test themselves, which is interesting.
It can blow their mind. I mean, it's just like
One thing I wanted to add, I've forgotten now about systemic work. I think that's last time we've been to Seville, I think Jan Jakob was sharing this one slide about what we've learned from Bert Hellinger. And one thing was around method of constellation. One thing was around systemic work itself and the framework and phenomenology and so on. I think the good point that he made there, it is possible to do systemic work completely without using constellations. So I think that's an important point too. I think you can use the whole framework without using the method itself. And at the same time, as he said, I think smartly then, it is possible just to use method of constellations without framework of the systemic work. So if you take it purely as a method, purely as a technique, I think you lose so much of its strength. And I would even say it's even almost like a misuse. You use like something like a technique, and maybe some people get completely in love, and it even at all at constellations as such. So let's do constellations. But the question is, so what exactly is serving this system better? And yeah, I think that's also maybe a point of consideration.
always working for the company or for the system, no? Always from that part, what would serve best to the company. Great. So we have time for our last question. Fiona.
I was going to say Dome. So the last question would be for our audience. So if you were to start today as a systemic facilitator, what advice would you have liked to be given?
Before, I mean, like from somebody else.
Exactly. What would you have liked to receive as an advice if you were to start today as a systemic facilitator?
Make peace with your parents first.
Good one.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's so important. I think that's a shortcut for also and not only with your not only with your parents. I think that's first step, but also accepting your family system as a whole, including all those, maybe who've been not so popular or excluded, or as well as the place where you were born. I think I would say also. So, and I don't think it's a country, but it's a land. I make a big difference there. I think the land and the territory where you were born and being able to acknowledge, to accept, to value the roots. I think that gives you strength in there. And so these two things, I think, but starting with your parents is the first step.
I like it very much. I mean, as the end of this conversation, going back to the roots for me, it's something, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I get that point of the land, not the country, where the root is, where mom and dad are, and where your family is. I think it's a great way to end this conversation. I really love that because I'm really connected to that.